Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel where stories aren't just told, they're felt. If you're someone who believes in empathy, justice, and truth, you're in the right place. They say time heals everything. But what if the wound keeps getting reopened again and again in everyday moments that most people don't even notice? Racism isn't always loud. It doesn't always scream through burning crosses or hateful slurs. Sometimes it whispers through silence, avoidance, and lost opportunities. Some might say, come on, things are better now. Why keep talking about racism? Others might argue, exactly, because it's hidden now. It's more dangerous than ever. Where do you stand? Before we get into the full story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more real voices, raw truths, and honest conversations to light. Every click counts and every story matters. Now let's begin. He only wanted to sit down and wait for his train. But one look from the officer changed everything. Not because he did anything wrong, just because of who he was. What followed next, it echoed far beyond that train station bench. Union Station always smelled like roasted peanuts, an old marble herald used to say. Today, it smelled like memories he hadn't invited. The rain outside was soft, almost thoughtful, the kind that tapped gently on the grand glass dome of Union Station in Washington, D.C. Inside, the buzz of announcements and footsteps layered with the steady rustle of newspapers and polite coughing. People came and went, commuters, tourists, executives, and tailored suits pulling sleek luggage. Amid them sat Harold Green, 76 years old, in a wool coat faded around the edges. He held a ticket in one hand, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper in the other. He wasn't in anyone's way. His train wasn't for another hour. All he wanted was to rest his knees and watch the station breathe. But then came the look. From across the atrium, a young security officer in a dark blue uniform clocked him. Not because Harold was doing anything suspicious. He wasn't panhandling, wasn't sleeping, wasn't disturbing the but there was something in that officer's face, a pause, a tightening of the jaw, the slight of the head, as if seeing Harold there in that particular seat was somehow a problem. Harold felt it. He always did. It wasn't new. He had grown up during segregation. He remembered the benches labeled whites only. He remembered the stares in diners, the whispers on buses. And though the signs were long gone, sometimes the eyes still spoke the same language. The officer approached. "Sir," he said politely but with a practiced edge. "Are you waiting for someone?" Harold raised an eyebrow, still holding his ticket between two fingers. "Waiting for a train." The officer nodded. Slowly, eyes scanning the man's coat, his shoes, then settling back on his weathered, proud face. "May I see your ticket?" Harold didn't flinch. "May. Though I don't recall everyone here needing to show one just to sit." There was no anger in his voice, just a calm that felt too still, like the eye of a storm. The officer hesitated but took the ticket. "Just a routine check, sir." Harold chuckled lightly, the kind that didn't rise to the eyes. It always is. He knew the drill. Saw it happen often enough. But this time, it was him again. As the officer examined the ticket, valid, paid in full, train, departing in 58 minutes. Harold's gaze didn't waver. He looked not at the uniform, but the young man inside it. "What's your name?" "Son," he asked. The officer blinked, caught off guard. "Peterson." "Officer Luke Peterson." "Well, Officer Peterson," Harold said gently, retrieving his ticket. "I've been coming through this station for 40 years. Never been a problem before, but maybe today I look like one." Peterson shifted. "That's not, sir. It's not personal. We're told to watch for loitering." "Loitering?" Harold repeated the word, curling in his mouth like something sour. "And how do you decide who's loitering and who's just waiting?" It was a question that reached further than the room. Peterson didn't answer. He didn't have to. Across the atrium, others watched. A woman lowered her coffee cup. A man scrolling through his phone paused. Even the janitor with his mop slowed down, eyes flickering. Harold sighed, not because he was angry, but because he was tired. Not from the walk to the station, but from the years that stacked silently. Behind moments like this, the quiet tests, the soft everyday judgments. Peterson stepped back. "You're good to stay, sir." "I apologize." Harold nodded. "I know you're doing your job. Wonder when your job will look different." The officer hesitated again, then turned and walked away. Harold watched him go, not with contempt, but with a kind of sorrow, irrecognition. The young man was doing what the system had trained him to do, and Harold had learned long ago not to confuse the uniform with the person. He bit into his sandwich. Moments passed. The station moved on. But the energy around him had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. A few seats away, a middle-aged woman offered a faint smile. Harold returned it. That was the thing about racism. It didn't always shout. Sometimes it just stared a second too long, asked one extra question, called for proof when none was needed. But Harold hadn't come for a fight. He'd come to catch a train. Long before Officer Peterson ever put on a badge, Harold Green had already survived. A world built to keep him out. But sometimes the past doesn't knock. It sits beside you, silent and heavy, waiting to be remembered. The clock ticked slowly above track 7 and the soft voice of the announcer echoed through Union Station, announcing boarding for a train Harold still had time to wait for. He shifted slightly in his seat, feeling the subtle stiffness in his knees. But it wasn't age that made him restless. Now it was memory. Because when Officer Peterson had walked away earlier, something stirred, something old. It looked around the grand hall, its polished stone, the Art Deco design still holding dignity even after this. But beneath its beauty, Harold remembered another time this very station in 1963. He had been 16, nervous, dressed in a pressed shirt his mother ironed the night before, and terrified because he was about to ride a train to Mississippi, joining a group of volunteers for what they called Freedom Summer. Back then, he had walked through this same space and was told plainly publicly he couldn't sit in the front waiting area. A porter had waved him toward a bench by the far wall near the restrooms. 4 colored travelers, the man said with a glance so practiced it didn't even carry malice, just habit. Harold didn't argue. He'd known better. But the bitterness of that moment never left him. And now all these years later, with civil rights bills passed, a black president served, and 1,000 panels and pledges made here, he was again being asked to prove he belonged. He sighed and stood up, stretching slightly. His coat slipped open, revealing a bronze pin on his lapel, small, nearly invisible. But it meant something. The symbol of the Freedom Riders gifted to him at the 50th anniversary reunion. He wore it not for attention but for grounding, a private signal to himself. You've seen storms. This is a drizzle. As he walked toward the coffee stand, someone caught his eye. A young woman, probably late 20s, with a Police Academy logo on her backpack. She was seated across from an older white woman, her grandmother perhaps. They were speaking softly, the younger one gesturing with clear frustration. "But Nana, you can't assume people are dangerous just because," she said, her voice tightening. She caught Harold's eye mid-sentence, then immediately looked away. He gave her a nod. Not judgmental, just aware. That was the thing. He'd stopped being angry years ago, but he never stopped noticing. Back at his bench, Harold found someone sitting beside his coat. It was Peterson, the officer. Harold paused, not out of fear, out of curiosity. "Mind if I sit a minute?" Peterson asked. Harold raised an eyebrow. "Already there, aren't you?" Peterson offered a tight smile. "I wanted to say sorry again. I know what that looked like." Harold said nothing. Let the silence stretch. "It's not an excuse," Peterson added, "but they drill into us. Watch for anything out of place. Sometimes that training, I guess it doesn't always leave room for common sense or respect." Harold sat slowly, setting his coffee down. "You ever hear of the Green Book, son?" he asked. Peterson looked puzzled. "The movie?" Harold smiled faintly. "Before the movie, it was a survival Black folks used it in the 40s through the 60s. Told you which gas stations, hotels, and restaurants were safe. Union Station wasn't in it. Not back then. Peterson blinked. I didn't know that. No reason you should, Harold said gently. But when you stopped me earlier, I wasn't mad at you. I was tired for the 16-year-old version of me, who once sat in the station wondering why just existing felt so offensive. Peterson looked down. I wasn't trained to think about things like that. It's time someone did the training, Harold replied. Because if you only see problems in people who look like me, you'll miss the real dangers walking right past you. For a moment, the young officer didn't speak. Then he asked, why did you come? Today? Not just the train. Why here now? Harold looked at him squarely. Because my grandson is graduating in Atlanta, first in our family to get a doctorate. He asked me to be there and I wasn't going to let a little flashback from history make me miss that. Peterson sat up straighter. Congratulations. That's incredible. It is, Harold said quietly. And that's why I'm still sitting here. Not because of how I was treated, but because I know why I still have to show up. Just then, the overhead speaker called. 4 passengers boarding train 314 to Atlanta. Harold stood up, gathering his coat. He paused, looking down at the young man in uniform. You ever wonder what kind of world you're helping build, Officer Peterson? The young man nodded slowly. More today than ever before. Then do better tomorrow, Harold said. Than you did today. That's all any of us can ask. He didn't wait for a reply. He walked toward his gate with calm dignity, his back straight, his pin shining faintly in the overhead light. As he handed over his ticket, he felt a small weight lift, not from forgiveness, but from having said what needed saying. And as he stepped onto the train, past rows of strangers and announcements and silence, he knew the past hadn't disappeared. It had simply found a seat beside him. But now he wasn't letting it drive. Some smiles aren't greetings. They're shields. And when the smoke behind them clears, you see what the world tried to hide. Pain, pride, and the quiet defiance of those who've survived more than anyone will ever know. The rhythmic clatter of the train echoed like a steady heartbeat as it slid across the tracks. Harold Green sat by the window, the world rushing past in blurry tones of green and gold. He wasn't watching the scenery. He was reading expressions not on a page but on the faces of the people across from him. An older woman offered a polite nod. A teenager bobbed his head to music, and near the dining car entrance, a white man in a tailored blazer threw a glance that lingered a little too long. Harold responded with a smile. Gentle, a practiced smile, not the kind that welcomed, but the kind that disarmed. He had spent a lifetime perfecting that smile. From the moment he was a boy, navigating school hallways where he wasn't wanted to boardrooms later in life where his experience was questioned, his smile had done what anger could not. It had bought him space, time, safety, and yet every time he used it, a small piece of truth stayed behind unsaid. He sipped from a paper cup of tea and thought about his grandson. Elijah would be pacing backstage right about now, rehearsing his speech, adjusting the collar of his robe. Harold could almost hear him. Granddad, I want you right there in the front row. You're the reason I'm walking this stage. He smiled again, but this time it cracked slightly because beneath the smile was smoke. Smoke from memories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Not because they were buried, but because they had never truly gone out. They smoldered quietly, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The conductor walked by offering a kind word. Everything all right here? Sir Harold nodded. Everything's fine. But wasn't, not completely. A few seats behind him, someone laughed. Too loudly. Then came the words, half whispered, half daring. Look at him. Probably got bumped up from coach. You know how it is. It wasn't said directly. That was the new way of things. Indirect racism wrapped in plausible deniability. Cowardice disguised as commentary. Harold turned his head slowly. Not in confrontation. Just in witness. He had been called worse. But what cut deeper wasn't the comment. It was the lack of reaction. No one corrected it. No one challenged it. Just the usual shuffle of newspapers. The polite silence that allowed discomfort to settle in unnoticed. Across the aisle, a young girl no older than 10 gave Harold a curious look. She had a tablet on her lap, cartoons flickering across the screen. Her gaze was innocent, untrained. She smiled at him, and Harold once again smiled back. This time there was warmth behind it. Later, as the train pulled into Charlotte for a scheduled stop, a small commotion stirred in the dining car. A woman, black, elderly, sharp-eyed, was speaking to a staff member. Her voice was calm but firm. "You said there was a seat and now suddenly there isn't. I've been standing here 15 minutes. Harold didn't mean to get involved. He told himself, especially after the airport incident, that he wouldn't spend energy fixing what wasn't his to break. But something in the woman's tone, a kind of weary dignity, called to him. He stood and approached gently. "Ma'am, you're welcome to sit with me if you'd like. There's room." She looked at him, then back at the attendant. "Is that all right?" The staff member hesitated. "Of course." The woman sat. "Thank you. Some things never change." Harold nodded. "And some things change because we don't let them stay the same." They sat in silence for a moment. "You remind me of someone," she. "My brother was in Selma, walked the bridge." "I was in Mississippi," Harold replied. She smiled. And this time it was real. Two survivors sharing more than just space. "You ever get tired?" she asked quietly. "All the time," Harold said. "But I'm still here." He returned to his seat just before the train rolled again, his tea now cold, his body a little heavier, and then an unexpected presence. Officer Peterson, the young man from Union Station. Clean-shaven civilian clothes, standing in the aisle. Harold blinked. "Didn't expect to see you again. I caught the next train out." Peterson said, "I wanted to apologize in person again, but more than that, I wanted to listen." Harold studied. "You know," he said slowly, "when I was your age, we used to say talk is. But what I've learned is that sometimes talk is all we've got before action catches up." Peterson sat across from him respectfully. "I watched your interview on that museum site, the Oral History Archive. I didn't know who you were when I questioned you. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them like they matter." "I know," Peterson said. "I'm trying to be better than the badge alone allows me to be." Harold leaned back. "Then don't carry it like a shield. Carry it like a mirror." The train swayed as it passed through a stretch of pine-lined countryside. The sun angled differently now later in the day. Shadows grew long. Peterson stood, offered his hand. "Thank you for not tearing me down when you could have." Harold took it. "You're still young. Torn down enough to know building lasts longer." As Peterson walked away, Harold allowed himself a long exhale. The smoke still lingered behind his smile, but it no longer suffocated. Entirely. And as the train hummed toward its next destination, Harold Green sat alone, his thoughts full of faces past and future. The girl with the tablet, the woman from the dining car, his grandson waiting in Atlanta. They were the reason he kept showing up, and the reason his smile, though lined with smoke, still burned with light. Hook Moja Part 4. It's never just about the seat. It's about who gets offered one, who's expected to stand, and what that silence in between really says about the world we've built. The air was thick with anticipation as the train crossed into Georgia. Atlanta shimmered on the horizon, a skyline of glass and steel stretching upward like it had something to prove. Inside the cabin, Harold Green adjusted his tie and checked the time. Less than an hour to go. He was early for Elijah's graduation. But time had never been a luxury he took lightly. Too many delays. Too many times history had taught him that early wasn't a privilege. It was a survival tactic. You showed up early. You made space. You gave no one a reason to question whether you belonged. A young couple boarded at the last stop, white-polished, dressed like they were headed to a high-end brunch rather than a train ride. The woman had a designer scarf wrapped perfectly at the neck. The man wore a tailored blazer, crisp jeans. They glanced at their ticket, then up the aisle, then at Harold. Their seats were beside him. Of course, they hesitated. She leaned toward him and whispered, "Maybe we can ask to be moved." Not so quiet after all. Harold didn't flinch. He smiled that same familiar smile, but inside something tugged. He'd hoped this trip might be different. The conductor returned minutes later. "Excuse me, sir. May I see your boarding pass one more time?" Harold had already shown it twice, but he handed it over anyway with quiet dignity. The conductor scanned it, nodded, and offered a perfunctor, good, before walking off. The couple sat stiff polite. They didn't look at Harold. Again. He didn't need them to. The silence said enough. Further up the car, a woman stood holding an infant. The baby squirmed restless. There were open seats nearby. Only 2 rows up, but no one offered. People pretended not to notice. Eyes stayed glued to phones, windows, magazines. Harold watched. Then he stood. He walked forward and offered his seat with it. Simple, "You'll be more comfortable here." She blinked in surprise. "Den, that's kind of you. But are you sure?" Nodded. "Absolutely." As she sat cradling her baby, Harold moved to the aisle. No one else moved. No one adjusted. So he stood. The train lurched slightly as it picked up speed, and Harold reached for the rail above. A small ache pulsed in his knees, age arthritis memory. He smiled faintly through the That's when it happened. A voice rang out, one he knew. Granddad Elijah. He stood near the cabin door in full graduation regalia, cap, gown, cords, bright eyes, and a stunned expression. "What are you doing standing?" Harold chuckled, "Giving my seat to someone who needed it more." Elijah didn't laugh. He frowned. He looked around the train car, scanning the seated passengers, some now shifting awkwardly. The baby cooed softly in the distance. Elijah turned to the couple in Harold's original row. "There are 2 seats there. Neither of you thought to offer one." They were silent. "No, of course not." Elijah muttered. "Granddad, come on. You're with me." He led Harold to the front of the car to a section marked reserved. Apparently, his university had arranged seating for special guests, faculty, speakers, alumni. Elijah had pulled strings. "You didn't have to do that," Harold said quietly. "I wanted to." Elijah replied. "You did more for me than any scholarship ever could." They sat for a moment. Neither said anything. The weight of the exchange still lingered. "I didn't want to cause a scene," Harold finally said. "You didn't," Elijah said. "The scene caused itself." He leaned in closer. "You know, in my speech today I wrote a line that reminded me of you. I said, justice doesn't always come with applause. It comes with clarity. With someone who notices when no seat is offered and still chooses to stand." Harold's throat tightened. Elijah smiled. "I didn't even realize I was describing you until just now." From behind them, a train staff member approached. "Mr. Green, we're terribly sorry. We've arranged for you to sit in the front lounge until arrival. There's a refreshment cart as well." Harold shook his head gently. "Thank you, but I'm fine. Right here." The attendant paused. "If there's anything we can do." Harold looked at Elijah. "You already did." The man nodded and left. Elijah pulled out his phone. Social media is already buzzing. Someone filmed that moment with the woman and the baby. Said, "This is what leadership looks like." Harold chuckled. "If only they knew I was just trying to stretch my legs." "You know that's not true." The city crept closer outside the window. Tall buildings, old churches, wide roads, history and progress stacked side by side. "Do you think it'll ever be different?" Elijah asked. "That someone like you won't have to keep standing just to prove you're allowed to sit." Harold exhaled. "I think it'll be different when enough of us stop pretending we don't see what's happening." The train made its final approach. The announcer welcomed them to Atlanta. And in that moment, amid the quiet hum of a slowing engine, the hush of passengers gathering their things, the ordinary sounds of travel, something extraordinary had occurred. The man gave Up a seat, a child gave it back, and a future watch ready to carry that story forward. Sometimes the loudest changes arrive without sirens or applause, just 2 feet stepping off a train and a name finally spoken with respect. The train eased into the station with a long sighing halt. The brakes hissed. The doors unlocked with a soft beep. People stood stretched, shuffled bags down from the overhead racks. Phones lit up like fireflies buzzing with texts and calls. "We're here." But Harold Green didn't move right away. He sat still, hands folded over his cane as the crowd moved around him like a river parting at a stone. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He simply wanted to feel the moment, the silence, the shift in air. Beside him, Elijah was already on his feet, holding his grandfather's coat. With quiet reverence. "You ready?" he asked. Harold looked out the window. "Been ready a long time. Just didn't know what I was waiting for." Stepped onto the platform together. It wasn't loud. No banner, no cameras, no parade. But something in the stillness felt ceremonial. Elijah's classmates waited near the escalator, some waving, others hugging family, professors in press suits, gathered in small circles. School officials adjusted earpieces and clipboards. The whole station buzzed with a soft clamor of a milestone moment. But when Harold stepped off the train, the energy near the tracks shifted. A few people paused mid-conversation. A conductor tipped his hat. A woman, one of the train attendants, offered a brief, solemn nod. No one said much, but eyes followed Harold's slow, sure steps. His presence was a kind of punctuation mark, quite heavy with meaning. At the base of the escalator stood a man in a slate-gray suit holding a sign that read, "Honored guests, Emery Shoe." Elijah waved him down. This. The man stepped forward quickly, looking first at Elijah, then Harold. "Mr. Green," he said, and not with formality, but with something bordering. "We've reserved a transport cart to take you straight to the auditorium. The ceremony begins in less than 30 minutes. "I can walk," Harold said. "No," the man replied gently. "But you don't have to." It was a small thing, but Harold noticed. The tone, the choice, not an offer made out of pity, not an assumption of fragility, but a simple, dignified gesture. So he accepted. They rode slowly past clusters of arriving guests. A few waved. One man, white, mid-50s, mouthed the words, "I saw what you did," and then lowered his gaze. Harold said nothing. He had nothing left to prove. When they reached the auditorium, Elijah guided his grandfather through the special entrance reserved for honorees and keynote guests. They passed a wall of portraits, judges, professors, benefactors, and Harold paused in front of one in particular, a stern white man. From the 1950s, framed in oak. Dean L. Stroud, Elijah read from the plaque. Led the school during desegregation. Famously fought to keep it elite. Harold raised an eyebrow. "Funny," he murmured. "He probably wouldn't have let me mop these floors, let alone walk into the front row." "And now," Elijah said, "you're sitting 2 seats from the university president." They moved into the hall. It was packed. Guests murmured and laughed. But when Harold entered, a ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. Some had seen the video clip of him giving up his seat. Others had read the article Elijah's classmate posted online. The man who sat when no one else stood. The dean, young biracial Sharpied, rose from his seat and offered Harold a handshake. "It's an honor," she said. "And long overdue." Harold smiled. "I've had my share of long waits." The ceremony began. Elijah's name was called near the end. He walked across the stage not just as a graduate but as a symbol, one tied not to a perfect journey but to a persevering lineage. He took his diploma, turned to face the crowd, and said into the mic, "I dedicate this moment to the man who taught me that dignity walks taller than power. My grandfather, Harold Green." The standing ovation followed. Not forced, not performative, real. Afterward, as people filed out of the hall one by one, they approached Harold, not with pity, but with respect. The judge shook his hand. A professor asked for a photo. A mother whispered, "Thank you. My son saw what you did. It made him ask me questions I didn't know how to answer, but I'm glad he asked." Harold gave each one the same quiet nod. That evening at the hotel, Elijah and Harold sat on the rooftop overlooking Atlanta's glowing sprawl. Planes blinked across the dusk sky. "No," Elijah said. "I used to think you were too quiet." "I still am," Harold replied with a smirk. "But now I get it," Elijah said. "You weren't being quiet. You were being watchful, measured." Harold took a long sip of his tea. "Had a lifetime to learn when to speak," he said, "and when to let silence carry the message." They sat like that for a while. No need for fireworks, no loud declarations, just a city breathing, a legacy settling into place, and a quiet arrival more powerful than any noise could ever be. In a world obsessed with speed, volume, and visibility, the story of Harold Green reminds us of a quieter, older kind of strength, one rooted in dignity, patience, and presence. There were no grand speeches when Harold gave up his seat on that train. No demands, no camera-ready protests, just an elderly black man rising from a place he'd earned. So someone else, someone younger, less weathered, less scarred, could sit. But that simple act sent shockwaves. It wasn't just a gesture of kindness. It was a reminder of the weight that many carry quietly, and the courage it takes to stay composed in the face of systemic assumptions. It was a refusal to let others define his worth, not through tone glances or policies dressed in politeness. Harold didn't fight that day with anger. He didn't argue with the train staff. He didn't demand acknowledgement or even respect. What he did was more disarming. He offered grace, and in that grace, he revealed the failures of others more clearly than 1,000 arguments ever could. That is the quiet power of presence. Elijah, his grandson, thought he was watching a small moment, but as it unfolded and as the truth behind it came to light, he saw what generations before him had long understood, that justice doesn't always enter a room with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in how you carry yourself, in the way you refuse to shrink even when the world tells you to sit down or move aside. The lessons we carry. There are a few key lessons that linger after this story. They aren't complex, but they are deeply human. First, never underestimate the power of stillness. In a world trained to reward loud voices and constant motion, stillness is often mistaken for weakness. But it is in stillness that you see what others miss. It is in stillness that you measure your response, not to react, but to choose what kind of legacy you want to leave. Second, your presence is your protest. For Harold, walking into a train car with a ticket in hand wasn't just travel. It was testimony. Sitting in a seat he paid for wasn't privilege. It was principle. When he stood up, it wasn't surrender. It was strategy. He knew when to walk. And more importantly, he knew that walking away didn't mean giving up. It meant rising above. Third, change doesn't always need a microphone. When Elijah shared the story online, when the law school recognized Harold publicly, when travelers watched the video of that train ride, what moved them wasn't rage. It was reflection. The story didn't demand your outrage. It asked for your attention. And in asking, it gave you the chance to see yourself in it, either as the man who stood up or as the silent onlooker who didn't. A mirror for the moment we're in isn't just a story about one train, one seat, one family. It's a mirror about the subtle ways racism still lingers and who gets offered a seat, who's asked for ID, who gets the benefit of the doubt. It's about the assumptions that float through our institutions wrapped in policy and procedure. And it's about how change starts not from outrage alone, but from the courage to be visible even when the world wants to look past you. We often think justice requires grand gestures. But real justice, it happens in ordinary places. In a waiting room, a train station, a school hallway, a grocery store aisle. It happens when someone says, "That's not right," or "I see you," or simply refuses to look Harold didn't set out to be a symbol. Neither did Elijah. They became one. Not because of what they shouted, but because of what they stood for and how. To you, the viewer, if you followed this story to the end, you've already proven that you care about stories that matter. Stories that don't just entertain, but challenge and reflect. And so, here's what I ask of you. If you were moved by Harold's dignity, share this story. Let others feel what you felt. Let it ripple outward. If it made you think differently, talk about it around your dinner table, in your classroom, at your workplace. Let it start a conversation that doesn't end with the credits. If you believe more stories like this deserve to be told, quiet, powerful human stories, then please subscribe to this channel, like, share, and hit the notification bell. Not for numbers, but for impact. Your support helps us continue to shine light where too often there's silence. Because silence is where bias hides, but it's also where resolve is built. This story be more than a moment. Let it be a reminder that who you are, how you treat others, and what you choose to see or not see shapes the world we all live. We'll keep sharing these stories. We hope you'll keep showing up to listen. Thank you for being here.